What is this panel? This is this panel, the lasting imprint, the how childhood trauma shapes our minds, our bodies, and our relationships. I'm Lorilee Binstock. I am a childhood sexual abuse survivor. I also host a podcast, a Trauma Survivor Thrivers podcast, and I'm editor-in-chief of Authentic Insider magazine. And I'm the moderator, obviously, I guess. But I will let everyone go ahead and introduce themselves.
Thanks. My name is Dr. Gabrielle Pelicci, and I'm a professor of holistic medicine and a psychonaut. I've been using plant medicine and psychedelics in my own healing journey to recover from trauma, and I recently wrote a book about it called All This Healing Is Killing Me, which you can find on the book table in the other room.
I'm Dr. Lindsay Bira. I'm a clinical health psychologist and adjunct professor of psychiatry at a medical school, and I'm clinical advisor for New Life, which is a ketamine-assisted therapy company.
I am Dr. Miriam Doom. I'm a clinical psychologist. I work in Miami. I have a breathwork studio as well, where I've integrated my own journey, and I run assisted ketamine treatment as well.
And I'm Martin Sims. I'm a neurosequential sports specialist and the founder of the Dope Coach Academy, where we teach coaches trauma-informed techniques and brain-based coaching.
Thank you. Well, I first want to ask, Martin, you said neurosequential specialist. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I don't know if everyone knows.
So neurosequential is just, it deals with neurodevelopment and how the brain develops in sequence. I always come up with a dope way to say it. So it's an acronym. The brain develops, organizes, processes, and engages in a sequential manner. And we understand how sequences of the body work, like the digestive system works by sequence. We eat, we chew, we swallow, we expel. And the brain works in a similar way, but in a bottom-up type of way. So the brainstem first processes everything, and then it goes up the midbrain, up through the limbic system into the prefrontal cortex. And if there is some type of trauma during our development, then it affects one of these sequences, and we need to start healing at that point of injury versus so basically if you're 30 and you know you had something that happened at 5, we need to treat the 5-year-old where it happened at and in that sequence before we can start going up through the other processes.
Wow. So, Dr. Barrett, you are a brain expert. Do you usually work? Well, you're known as the brain expert, as I've read. Do you believe this is put into practice in healing sequentially childhood trauma?
Yeah, it's a great question. And so, I view myself as kind of an expert in neuroscience and how the brain functions, but how we work with that behaviorally. Because as a psychologist, we don't really measure what's going on in the brain. We measure the emotions and behaviors that come out of the brain and cognitions, right? Emotions, cognitions, and behaviors. And so when I think about how the brain heals, I actually think that's very accurate is, when we have a trauma, what gets embedded is that trauma response from the fight, flight, or freeze perspective. And that's very much that lower brain process, so the brainstem and the limbic system. I like to say with PTSD and trauma, it's essentially like the brain has been hijacked. So as you move through the world, you're having this consistent trauma response that comes from those places in the brain. And then when we look at the treatment that works, and there's many, including psychedelics that we're finding out, is a lot of it has to do with going back to those areas and eliciting some fear response, exposure therapy, so that we can habituate and desensitize to those feelings, and then the brain can learn something new. So we're working with the limbic system whenever we do that. Yeah.
Wonderful. And we talk about relationships. I feel like relationships, we don't realize how badly our relationships are affected when we experience childhood trauma. Miriam, how do you believe it affects our relationships, how the trauma from childhood affects our relationships beyond, even into adulthood?
Actually, I'm going to talk about myself here because I am the grandchild of Holocaust survival. So when in your family, there's so much trauma, there's always this game of the superhero, the aggressor, and the victim. So you're always fighting to be there somehow. The ego makes you connect with the external world through those three, that triangle, where, somebody has to be, wrong. Somebody's the evil one. And you're trying to define yourself there in terms of your survival mode, what really makes you survive. So if you're this resilient human being, you're going to end up in the superhero role. If you are this person that somehow you were weaker in your family, you will hide in the victim. And when you are there, you need other people to be part of that story that you build. So when you have trauma, you ended up living a story as a means of anticipating what's next. So you protect yourself in that role, which is kind of like the role that actually protected you when you were a child. In my case, I was somehow the superhero, let's put it that way. I'm not proud of that at all. It has, its downside. So then it's hard to connect through authenticity. So you hide in that place of identity, predictability, because that's what actually trauma does. It makes you believe that in uncertainty, there's something bad going on. Why? Because that bad things happen in uncertainty. Life is uncertain. So you try to create a bunch of stories, and then you actually don't meet the person. You are putting that person in that category to make you feel safe, instead of actually connecting and having a relationship with that human being from a place of authenticity.
Gabrielle,
Yes.
I wanted to talk to you about healing just because I love this. Martin and I were talking about the title of your book, All This Healing is Killing Me. Well, when someone is going through the hard times, and it's hard to believe that post-traumatic growth is real when you're in the thick of trauma and struggle. How do you push past it knowing that it is a struggle to heal in itself?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think my paradigm on trauma is a little bit divergent. We've heard an approach that's a neurology approach. We've heard a meaning-making approach around narrative. And my approach tends to be more energetic. I think of trauma as a disruption, like an energy surge that comes into the system. And if we don't have the resilience and the capacity to hold, digest, process, move that surge through us, it gets stored. And then as more experiences come along, they also have a surge, an energetic imprint. We carry them, it becomes cumulative, and we have all this dysregulation around it, which can look like symptoms in relationships, can look like physical or mental symptoms. What I think is possible is creating a container of resilience and strength using different allies, using the plants, using relationships, using different therapeutic tools, so we can move that energy through us in a way that creates more spaciousness and wholeness. And we know that the etymology of the word healing is wholeness, which is really what I think we're trying to achieve with our healing. And along the way, as that wave is moving through, like any kind of wave, it might be uncomfortable for some time, right? My journey, All This Healing is Killing Me, is how much of that work that I had to do to process the traumas that we're moving through, and how much resilience I had to build to get through to the other side. And one of the takeaways for me in my writing and in my work is just how strong and powerful we are, and what warriors we are to all be engaging in this path, and to be doing this not only for ourselves but for the collective well-being.
Well, we are at a psychedelic conference, so I want to ask you all, how do you believe psychedelics can heal childhood trauma? Anyone can go first.
Who wants to start?
I'll jump in. For me personally, it gave me an ally, a teacher, and a resource to support the confrontation. I had used a lot of modalities. I had used massage therapy and energy therapy and psychotherapy and breath work and yoga and meditation. I had used everything, and I had gotten to a point where I still had blind spots. I still had things that I was holding on to. One of the things I say in my book is, you're only as sick as your secrets. So there were secrets that I was holding that I was terrified to share. And the plants made me feel safe. They made me feel like I wasn't alone. They made me feel like I would be supported and that there would be a regeneration if I allowed this stuff to process. And so I think that the sentience of the plant medicine really facilitates a way for us to hold ourselves in compassion and to allow these experiences of the past to be transformed into our wisdom and our strength.
Martin, I saw, oh.
Yeah, well, in my experience, I was able to kind of relive the trauma in a way. And as an adult, I was able to relive the childhood trauma. And when I speak about like what parts develop, there's certain things that haven't quite developed yet for children in their cortex for them to be able to process certain emotional things. So our capacity to handle a trauma while we are children isn't like our capacity should be when our brains have fully developed. We just don't have the capabilities in that way. And so for me to be able to go back to a space where I was traumatized extremely and be able to sit there and unpack that in a way that, I don't know, it was colorful, but it was very real. And so it gave me a new story to tell, in which kind of helps everything after that. And so I think that's why it helped me in that way. And I've done some other things, not psychedelics, but like how she was saying, like different modalities. You want to work out, you playing with sports, you getting involved with a lot of, communities and relationships and things of that nature, but it didn't quite have the same impact as adding psychedelics to those spaces and just coming to a different consciousness about those things that happen and how to move forward from there. Because I think we get tied into the stories and we keep retelling the stories, we keep activating the trauma in that way. And so I think that's how it helped me.
Okay. Personally, if I have to summarize it, the moment that I started experimenting with psychedelics, for me, it was the feeling of essence. I understood who I was without a story. And that was something huge for me because I thought I was guilt. That's what I thought I was, pretty much. Because we are what we feel at the end. And then suddenly I start realizing that there is something in your chest that it's expanding, it just expands. It's a feeling that is so difficult to describe. And that's where I started understanding that actually the mind can only give you so much information. And as a clinical psychologist, trained with psychodynamic therapy, CBT, I rationalized everything. I started realizing that really the power is in the body. But when you have trauma, you don't want to feel your body. You're afraid of feeling your body. Even if you had a father that didn't hit you, but it felt like he was going to hit you, that's trauma. Because you imagine in yourself every time that he got upset that maybe he was going to hit you. In the mind of that child, you were going to hit, and it was your fault. It was always your fault. And when you experience that type of experiences, as an example, then your body, you don't want to feel. So it brought me to that feeling, and that's where actually I changed even the way I treat my patients. My therapy, it's about identifying the ego and feeling essence. Because to be alive, it means that you have to attend. You have to pay attention to an object. If not, you're dead. It's gravity, oxygen, and attention. Then you're alive. And I was in that journey of, okay, I understand my ego perfectly. I've done therapy a bunch of times, but I still keep repeating the patterns. And what is an ego? It's thoughts, emotions, and actions. And I kept being in the same thing, and I will repeat the action based on all of that without being able to change. And then, wow, I can change when I start feeling myself from a different place. And that's what the gift that gave me and the gift that I'm trying to give other people, it's exactly that, finding essence.
I also think that psychedelics give us the ability to experience very pure emotion, like to experience the feeling of pure love or even motherly love or acceptance and empathy. So, there's different types of psychedelics and different types of substances, but the ability to teach the nervous system how to embody that emotion can be very, very healing, and it carries forward. I also think that something amazing that psychedelics does is it gives you the other side of the story. So if we look at PTSD, it's a rigid interpretation of what happened, and it's a lot victim-based and distrust of others. It changes the construct of kind of how you think about yourself, other people in the world. And so psychedelics kind of flips that on its head, and it takes it from a view of right here to like this greater view, or maybe a view from the other side in a way that you would not be able to access normally. And so it's, that has to do with kind of affecting the default mode network. We're getting very neurobiological with that, because I think there's absolutely an energetic and spiritual component that we cannot measure nor really understand that goes so deep. But basically, we're opening up doors of consciousness and perception and awareness that allows us to create a totally different understanding in a story. And that does get embedded and then kind of woven through, but it does take some integration to make sense of it and reinforce it.
Can I add something to what you said? Yeah. I'm studying Kabbalah, okay? Kabbalah. Okay. So the default mode, okay, in Spanish is Kabbalah. Okay, the default mode, okay, which I'm super interested in that. The Kabbalah, okay, says that there's like an empty space in us. And the key to have a beautiful life or a purposed life has to do with filling that empty space with faith. At that time, I'm like, oh my God, the Kabbalah speaks about the default mode,
Awesome. I don't know if we have time for this question, but I did want to talk about exploring the bad trip when you're really going deep into childhood trauma. I know for me, as a childhood sexual abuse survivor, that really did come up for me in my first trip, but this was actually not assisted. This is when I was a teenager and I didn't know how to deal with it. But knowing what I know now, I know that there's so much growth in that bad trip or the pain that you experience. Can any of you talk a little bit about the bad trip?
You and I had this conversation on the phone.
Yeah.
It was a powerful conversation. And I think of bad trips as falling into two categories. But one of them is bad, and it's labeled bad just because it's uncomfortable. It's kind of like when you go to boot camp and you're working out so hard that you feel nauseous, and it's bad in a good way. And then the other kind of bad trip is that the trip is actually really harmful, right? So you had told me about your experience, and you didn't feel supported, and you didn't feel like you had the resources to process that experience, right? And you didn't even know when you were taking the medicine what you were really getting yourself into, right? And so you had just mentioned, right, set and setting, the integration, the therapy assistance that we put around the medicine for this purpose. And I think educating people about the fact that you might be uncomfortable, when you go back to the childhood memories, it might be uncomfortable, and you might describe it as bad, but it's only bad in the sense that it didn't feel very good. And on the other side, there is healing, there is regeneration, there is relief. Versus, I had a conversation with someone recently that was horrifying. He's like, oh, I'm not that into ayahuasca. I'm like, why are you not that into ayahuasca? He was like, oh, well, I had a bad experience. I was like, how did you do it? He's like, I ordered it on the internet. I did it in my house. I kept taking more and more because I couldn't feel anything. And then I felt like I was high for 3 weeks and I didn't know what reality was. This is the exact reason why we're at this conference. This is the purpose of why we're all here, so that doesn't happen, so that we don't have these horror stories about people having really bad trips that are irreversible and dangerous.
I want to add on to that from the clinical psychology side, and I just did a talk on another stage, because what we're seeing in practice, and I just talked to a colleague of mine who's another psychologist, is people coming into therapy from really bad trips that are damaging. And I think something that I'm speaking on is a lot of times when we, say all these amazing things about psychedelics and psychedelics are the answer, we're hanging a giant carrot on a stick for the rest of the people that do not have the connections to a support system or the understanding. And they're going to find experiences or seek an experience that actually can be damaging. And I do believe that there are bad trips. We say there's no bad trips, just hard experiences. Actually, if you're not prepared, it can be very damaging, confusing, totally destabilizing. And who wants to be taken out of their roles and responsibilities that can actually negatively affect their life? No, not helpful, right? And so I think what we have to really remember is that there can absolutely be some danger around this. And I say we all need a good dose of healthy trepidation. And especially when we speak about psychedelics, to also add something in there. And also, it's very important how you seek it, where you seek it, who you do it with. We have to do that research and get connected. Otherwise, it can be damaging. So I appreciate that question.
Yeah, very good. Now, if you are prepared, if you get your ego, because at the end a bad trip means that there was a big fight with the ego for me, okay? If you understand the reason of being there, which is the fully letting go and allow the medicine to be a professor, to be a teacher, if you understand that this is a process of resilience and not a process of now all my problems are solved, okay? Then I do believe that bad trips don't exist. But you have to be really understanding from an ideological perspective. This is, what is your philosophy at the end when it comes to psychedelics? I mean, what is the purpose of that medicine in your body? And when you trust that it is a medicine, then you understand that everything that you're going to live at that moment, it's really for you. And it is such a unique experience for each of us that it's amazing. It's exactly what you need. So I agree. I think we call bad trips when it's an irresponsible use. That's the way I see it.
Well, I think my worst trip was probably my best trip in terms of how much breakthrough that I had. And so I actually just went back to the place of the trauma that I experienced, and I walked through it as an adult. And I walked through the whole space. My neighbor died at my house when I was 14 years old while we were playing basketball, and I wasn't able to process that right. Mental health wasn't a topic at the time. It wasn't like you get support from psychologists or psychiatrists. You just kind of go back to school and they want you to just finish and do the homework and everything like that. But that really, it forced me to have to become a new person even in the moment, and I didn't know how to do that. I wasn't supported. So as an adult, when I tried to process that, it was very hard because it happened at my mother's house, and what I wasn't factoring in was all the other traumas that happened at my mother's house that wasn't the one that I was focusing on. And so that triggered me in a lot of ways while I was dealing with it, but the breakthrough was there. Everything that I intended in that one, and I think intention is important when it comes to these psychedelic medicines and things of that nature, because if we go in with a certain intention, then we generally get what we asking for, probably not in the way that we were looking for it, and that's a good thing too. But processing it as an adult, understanding what psychedelics did, I didn't get into it until I did enough research about it. I wasn't like, oh, I need to do something. I grew up in an area where everything was a drug to me, so I didn't want to touch it. So I did a lot of research, and without the research, without the pioneers who were doing it and sharing their stories, I probably would have never done it. And the representation also matters as well. So if only because I had a friend of mine who also done it, looks like me, then I could give it a try, so to speak. And so that makes a difference too, because I just think representation matters, and how we speak about it, how we speak about our experiences, according to your talk just a minute ago, that's huge. It's hugely important how we do this, because it can be dangerous. I do think water's a good thing until you have too much of it in the wrong way. Then it can be dangerous. It can be deadly. You know what I mean? So I think the same thing about the psychedelics. We have to do it responsibly. We need to make sure we talk about it responsibly. And I think as we push this movement forward, we do have the best practices for dealing with it, so we don't have the people that are damaged by it or have experiences that they can't quite understand while they're doing it or when they finish doing them. So yeah, I think we need to do it responsibly, but also have great intention with it.
Wonderful. Do we have time for questions? Yes.
Who's first? Who's on first? What's on second? Just kidding. I'm just trying to laugh.
Hi, good afternoon. Absolutely, it's my pleasure. Thank you for all being here. I just wanted to touch on the last question that you asked about the bad trip. I volunteered for a project called Fireside Project, which was a call line for people going through or had already gone through a psychedelic experience that they didn't know how to process. And as a volunteer on that line for a little bit, it was quite eye-opening that, yeah, without proper education, things can go pretty awry very fast. And talking to some of the callers that were currently tripping or people who had already tripped and didn't know how to process, that was alarming to me. I'm a very studious person, so if I'm gonna do something, I wanna know everything about it and then do some more research and then ask a few more questions and then participate. So my question to anyone on the panel is, what is a good resource that you found to help prepare oneself for an upcoming adventure or a trip? Or like, how do you, one who has no kind of inkling, where do they start, in your opinion?
Oh, my wife is a good place to start. She hosts psychedelic retreats on psilocybin, and like what she does is she does a great job of like asking questions and making sure there's a great assessment part involved with people who get ready to do psychedelics. There's also this connection part where they need to feel safe, not only in their bodies, but also with around the people that they're around when you have these psychedelic experiences. That's huge. And then the integration piece afterwards, because after you have these situations and you go through these various states of consciousness, someone to be there to catch you in that space is huge, and someone to make you feel safe throughout the beginning process, the during process, and when it's over. And then you have a better chance of having a good trip in that way. I think that's the responsible way to go, one of the responsible ways to go, and I'm sure they have other ways to go about it.
Yeah, preparation is important, preparing the mind and body, a detox diet, disconnecting, getting ready to have the experience. I spend a couple of weeks before a journey just getting in the right mindset, and then I think mentorship is crucial. I lived and worked with some medicine women for a period of time to really develop a relationship to the medicine that I was working with. Not everyone has that luxury, obviously, but you could start with small doses and just build that relationship over time so that it's something that's a bit more familiar and comfortable when you go into a deeper experience.
I like that because I think sometimes people dive in too much too fast, and that becomes very overwhelming. We don't have the tools, we haven't developed the relationship with it. So I think it very much is a relationship. I was just going to add also the one-on-one support. I think before, to understand your goals and somebody that you trust is going to go at your pace again, I think is very important.
And I'm going to add breath work, not because I teach it, because it works. It really teaches you to let go. When you are there and you're having certain images or certain situations that are hard to manage, if you do the let go, and it's a muscle. For me, it's a muscle in the brain that you end up practicing. When you are in that moment, it's amazing because you truly can start disengaging from the story with the fight of the ego and then going into really the physical sensations that are incredible when you are in the medicine.
I think that is our time.
No, it's not.
It's
because
not.
We're waiting for the
Well, I
next
don't understand.
speaker. I know. We're waiting. The next speaker is actually on his way here because he's in another panel. Who's got another question?
Well, I'd actually like to add I'll add really quickly to her answer. I did a lot of internal family systems therapy. That was just the minimum. I needed to do a minimum of like 8 sessions to really get to know my parts and the darker parts, the shadow, and because those are the parts that are going to come up. And if you are familiar with them, it's not going to be as scary. So that's just something I wanted to add. But yes, your question? Oh, wait, where's the mic?
So I'm going to, so what did you have?
All right, hello everyone. I'm Aziza Kabibi, and I run a nonprofit called Precious Little Ladies, Inc. And our mission is to combat child molestation, domestic violence, and sexual assault. I'm a longtime survivor of incestuous abuse by my father. And while I've never explored psychedelics, in working with survivors, of course, I want to be open to all outlets and all resources to help them heal. So my perspective is a little off only because my brother, he had a bad trip and he ended up committing suicide. So, and that was with using ayahuasca, trying to deal with the fact that he had witnessed my father abusing me. So as a secondary survivor, he had a negative experience. But I'm open to education, to, you know, wanting to exploring, to understanding how psychedelics could help, because childhood trauma is extremely, extremely impactful on our communities. So my question is, how would you know, or if any of you can recommend when working with a survivor of sexual abuse, if it seems that nothing else is working, whether it be talk therapy or exercise or anything else, what would you say are some of the markers that something like psychedelics could be beneficial for them?
We have only space for one person to answer that question, so who would like to take it? Thank you.
First of all, I would like to say I know of you, and I've heard of you, and I've learned about you. And thank you for the work that you do, because I actually use you as an example for so many of my childhood sexual survivor patients. So I just want to say that. When you started speaking, I was like, oh, there she is. So thank you. I would also add, I can take this, because it's a very delicate subject, and I appreciate you sharing that about your brother, because I view ayahuasca, and I'm no expert in this whole psychedelic area, but I view ayahuasca as one of the most intense, besides ibogaine, that somebody can go into. So I think that's doing a lot really fast, and a lot depends on the container and the intentions that you have going into it. When I think about somebody with significant trauma, I almost want to start them on a path of more of like the feeling-based, to make feelings more approachable, which is like MDMA, and slowly being able to open and have compassion and empathy and different ways of looking at something before they go super, super deep. Because that can be very risky. Even high-dose psilocybin, that takes you to some very weird places. And if you don't have the context to make sense of it, it can be really weird and mess with your sense of reality and bring things in that like you don't know how to deal with. So I think we need to be very careful about that, doing too much the hoorah around the big plant medicines, and really understanding the path of opening that we can train somebody to relate. So like ketamine, psilocybin, or MDMA, but I really think there's a lot of power in MDMA, and that's why we're seeing it being one of the first ones that's approved.
All right, thank you so much for the panelists and for questions. Gratitude.